He's guilty. People like him always are. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom, sinking into the silence like a sharp blade. It wasn't just a verdict, it was a proclamation, a reminder of the balance of power, and who it favored. The room was filled with tension so thick, it was almost suffocating. Every eye was on the bench, and yet no one dared to speak. Not after those words. A young man stood there, hands trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. He had done nothing wrong. He knew it, everyone who truly knew him knew it. But here, in this room, truth was irrelevant. It was about control, about sending a message. And the judge wasn't about to let this opportunity slip. "Your kind," the judge continued, leaning back with a satisfied smirk, "should have learned by now that there are consequences. You don't just walk around, thinking you can buy property and act like you belong. Not here. Not on my watch." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. But the young man remained silent, his gaze fixed on the judge, the weight of every unfair accusation bearing down on him. He was just trying to build a future, to buy a small piece of land where he could start fresh, make something of himself. But for the judge, it wasn't about the land. It was about making a statement, reminding everyone who was truly in charge. In the back of the courtroom, a man sat watching, fists clenched, heart pounding. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, what he was seeing. His brother was being humiliated, stripped of his dignity, all because he dared to dream, to own something in a place where his very presence was unwelcome. And there was nothing he could do but watch as his brother's future was shattered in front of everyone. "You want to own land here?" the judge scoffed. "You think you can just walk in and change things? Maybe this will teach you a lesson." He banged the gavel, the final blow that sealed the young man's fate. The sentence was harsher than anyone could have expected. Outrageous fines, a criminal record, and the threat of jail time if he even dared to contest it. It was more than punishment, it was a declaration of dominance. The man in the back wanted to shout, to storm the bench and demand justice, but he knew better. He'd seen it happen too many times. Anyone who spoke up was only met with more cruelty, more disdain. So he swallowed his rage, but inside, something was boiling. He knew this wasn't over. It couldn't be. Not this time. That night, as the court emptied and the whispers died down, the judge was already celebrating his small victory, another troublemaker put in his place. What he didn't realize was that he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. The young man's brother wasn't just anyone. He was a man of the law too, someone who had spent his life upholding the rules, believing in a system of justice. But watching what happened in that courtroom, he understood something that day: the system was only as just as the people running it. And today, justice had failed. From that moment, everything changed. No longer content to play by the rules, the brother set out to uncover the truth behind the judge's actions. He started digging, through court records, old cases, anything that could prove that this wasn't just about his brother. And the deeper he went, the more he found. There were whispers of shady deals, closed-door meetings, and a pattern of rulings that always seemed to favor the same people. A judge who was supposed to be the epitome of fairness was instead manipulating the law for his own gain, using his power to keep others down, to keep control. But proving it wasn't going to be easy. The judge had allies, people who had a lot to lose if the truth ever came out. And for every step forward, there were new obstacles, new threats. But the brother was relentless. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting to restore his own faith in a system that had betrayed him, to prove that even in a world that seemed determined to crush hope, there was still a chance to make things right. The judge thought he had won, that his authority was untouchable. He had no idea that someone was watching him closely, waiting for him to slip up. And slowly, piece by piece, the brother was building a case, one that could not only expose the judge's actions but bring down the entire network of corruption that had enabled him. This was more than just a battle in a courtroom. It was a fight for dignity, for the right to dream, for the belief that justice should be blind to everything but the truth. And as the investigation continued, the brother realized that he wasn't alone. Others, too, had been wronged, silenced by the judge's influence, and they were ready to come forward. But could he pull it off? Could he bring down a man who seemed untouchable, a judge who held the power to ruin lives with a single sentence? Every moment brought new risks, new stakes. And for the judge, things were starting to unravel, but he was still confident. After all, he had the power, the connections, and years of experience playing this game. "People like you don't belong here," he had said. But what happens when the very system he used to enforce that belief turns against him? As the brother's investigation comes to a head, he finds himself at a crossroads. The evidence is there, but exposing it would mean risking everything: his career, his safety, and even the possibility of retaliation. But the alternative? Allowing the judge to keep ruining lives, to keep abusing his power? That was something he could never live with. So he took a leap, and the case against the judge became public. The courtroom that once echoed with the judge's authority was now filled with whispers of a different kind, of corruption, of betrayal, of a reckoning long overdue. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The judge's allies were scrambling, trying to keep him out of the spotlight, to shut down the investigation. But it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no way to stop it. But as the tension mounted, there was still one question lingering over everything: would justice finally be served, or would the judge's influence be enough to escape the consequences? One man's fight for justice had turned into a battle that would change everything. And as the final pieces fell into place, the only thing left to find out was just how far the judge would fall, and who would be there to see it happen. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say something important. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or prejudice. We believe in equality, respect, and justice for all, and we use our stories to shed light on the struggles and triumphs that matter. If you've ever faced injustice, know that we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy this gripping story. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful tales. Thank you for being here, and we hope you enjoy. Terence sat at his kitchen table, staring at the early morning light streaming through the window. The day had just begun, but he felt as if the weight of the world was already pressing down on his shoulders. As the chief of police in Charleston, South Carolina, he was used to handling pressure. He had faced countless challenges throughout his career, but none had prepared him for what happened in that courtroom a few months ago. What he saw, what he heard, still haunted him. It wasn't just about the law, it was personal. Because the man who had been humiliated, stripped of his dignity in front of everyone, was his younger brother, Darnell. Terence had always been protective of Darnell. Growing up, they faced their fair share of struggles, being one of the few black families in a neighborhood that didn't always welcome them. Terence had learned early on how to stand his ground, how to keep his head high even when others tried to bring him down. That resilience had guided him through life, pushing him to excel, to rise through the ranks of the police force, and to become a respected figure in the community. But Darnell was different. He was the dreamer, the one who always believed things could be better, that people could change. He saw the good in everyone, even when it wasn't there. Darnell had saved for years to buy a small piece of land on the outskirts of Charleston, a quiet spot where he hoped to build his future. He talked about it constantly, painting vivid pictures of the small coffee shop he wanted to open, a place where people could gather, feel welcome, and find a little peace in their day. Terence knew how much that dream meant to Darnell. It was more than just a business, it was a chance to create something of his own, something that no one could take away from him. Or at least, that's what they both thought. The problem started when Darnell finally bought the land. At first, it seemed like everything was falling into place. But then came the rumors, the whispers that someone powerful wanted that land for themselves. Terence brushed them off at first. Charleston was a growing city, and land disputes happened all the time. But it quickly became clear that this wasn't just a minor issue. Things escalated fast. There were phone calls, thinly veiled threats, and suddenly Darnell found himself facing a lawsuit. He was being accused of trespassing, of buying the land illegally. It was absurd, but what made it worse was that the case was assigned to Judge Richard Sterling, a name that sent a chill down Terrence's spine. Judge Sterling was known in Charleston. To some, he was a respected figure, a man who had served the city for over 2 decades. But to others, especially those who had been on the wrong side of his rulings, he was something entirely different. Sterling had a reputation, one that was hard to prove but impossible to ignore. He was known for his harsh sentences, his disdain for anyone he deemed inferior, and most disturbingly, for his subtle but ever-present bias. To many in Charleston's black community, he was a reminder of a time when justice wasn't blind, and equality was just a word. Terrence had never crossed paths with Judge Sterling directly, but he had heard the stories. He knew how the judge operated, the way he could twist the law to suit his purposes, and he knew the kind of damage Sterling could do. That's why he was there, sitting in the back of the courtroom on the day of Darnell's hearing, hoping, praying that maybe, just maybe, things would be different this time. But it wasn't. From the moment Sterling walked into the room, Terrence could see it in his eyes, the cold, calculated look of someone who had already made up his mind. Darnell stood in front of the bench, trying to explain himself, to make the judge see reason. But Sterling barely listened. He didn't care about the facts, didn't care about the paperwork that clearly showed Darnell had bought the land fair and square. To Sterling, this wasn't about legalities, it was about sending a message. And when he spoke, it was like watching a predator toying with its prey. "You must think you're clever," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Buying a piece of land and thinking that makes you somebody. But let me tell you something. You're not fooling anyone. People like you, they don't belong here. They never have, and they never will." Terrence's heart pounded in his chest, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to shout, to scream at the judge to stop, but he couldn't. He was a man of the law, and he knew that if he made a scene, it would only make things worse for Darnell. So he sat there, swallowing his anger, as Sterling continued. "Here's how this is going to work," Sterling said, leaning forward, a twisted smile curling on his lips. "You're going to drop this nonsense, or I'm going to make sure you regret ever setting foot in my courtroom. Do you understand me?" Darnell's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and defiance. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sterling cut him off. "Don't bother. This isn't a negotiation. It's a warning." And with that, the gavel came down, a final, resounding symbol of Sterling's power. The ruling was swift, brutal, and unfair. Darnell was ordered to pay an outrageous fine, and if he didn't comply, he faced jail time. Terrence watched as his brother's shoulders slumped, the weight of the judge's words crushing him. He had never seen Darnell look so defeated, and it tore him apart. As they left the courtroom, Terrence's mind was racing. He had seen injustice before, but this was different. This was personal. Sterling hadn't just attacked Darnell's rights, he had attacked his dignity, his very right to exist as an equal. And Terrence knew, as he walked out of that courthouse, that he couldn't let it end like this. Not without a fight. Darnell tried to put on a brave face, but Terrence could see the hurt, the frustration, the anger simmering beneath the surface. They had been through tough times before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a setback, it was an assault, a deliberate attempt to crush Darnell's spirit. And for Terrence, that was unacceptable. He had spent his life believing in the law, in justice, in the idea that doing the right thing would make a difference. But now, for the first time, he felt like those beliefs were being tested. How could he uphold a system that allowed someone like Sterling to sit on the bench? How could he stand by and watch his brother's dreams be torn apart by a man who thought he was untouchable? Terrence didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. This wasn't just about Darnell's land anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about proving that people like Sterling couldn't get away with their abuse of power. And if the law wasn't willing to hold him accountable, then Terence would find another way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, Terence made a silent promise to himself. This was just the beginning. Sterling thought he was untouchable, but he was about to find out just how wrong he was. Terence couldn't shake the image of Darnell standing there, vulnerable and crushed, from his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his brother's defeated expression, the way his shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of every injustice he had ever faced. It kept him awake at night, fueling a fire inside him that he hadn't felt in years. He had always been the one to play by the rules, to follow the letter of the law. But this time, the law had betrayed them, and he was done playing fair. Terence knew that if he wanted to fight back, he needed to be smart. Sterling was no ordinary judge, he was a man with connections, someone who had built a wall of influence around himself that made him nearly untouchable. But every wall had cracks, and Terence was determined to find them. So, he began digging. Late at night, after long days at the precinct, he would pore over old case files, scanning through records, looking for any hint of corruption, any sign that Sterling had used his power to manipulate outcomes. It wasn't long before he found his first clue. A series of rulings that seemed off, almost too consistent. Cases that should have had different outcomes but somehow always ended in favor of certain parties that, as Terence discovered, had financial ties to Sterling. It was a small connection, but it was enough to start building a bigger picture. He didn't have the full story yet, but he was starting to see a pattern, and that was more than enough to keep him going. As the weeks passed, Terence became more obsessed, spending every spare moment on his investigation. He knew he was walking a dangerous line. If Sterling got wind of what he was doing, things could go south very quickly. But he couldn't stop. Every time he thought about giving up, he would remember the way Sterling had sneered at Darnell, the way he had made it clear that he didn't care about justice, only about maintaining his own power. One night, Terence's search led him to an old friend, Lisa, a journalist who had spent years covering local politics. She was sharp, relentless, and had a knack for finding stories that others couldn't. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would think to look for them. "You know this is dangerous, right?" Lisa said, stirring her coffee as she glanced around the room. "Sterling's got friends in high places. You start poking around, and it won't just be your career on the line." "I know," Terence replied, his voice steady. "But this isn't about my career. It's about Darnell. It's about stopping Sterling from doing this to anyone else. I need your help, Lisa. I need to know how deep this goes." Lisa studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But if we're going to do this, we do it right. We need proof, something concrete that links him to corruption. Otherwise, he'll just deny everything, and you'll be the one left holding the bag." For the next few weeks, they worked together, quietly gathering evidence. Lisa reached out to contacts she had built over the years, and Terence continued to sift through files, looking for any piece of information that might connect Sterling to illegal activities. It was slow, grueling work, and there were times when it felt like they were getting nowhere. But little by little, the pieces began to fall into place. One evening, Terence got a call from Lisa. Her voice was tense, barely above a whisper. "You need to see this," she said, and before he could ask what she meant, she hung up. They met again, and this time, she had a folder with her, filled with documents that made Terence's heart race. There were financial records, emails, and correspondences that painted a picture of a judge who wasn't just biased, he was corrupt to his core. Sterling had been taking bribes for years, using his position to secure favorable rulings for businesses and individuals who were willing to pay the right price. And it wasn't just about money. Some of the names on those documents were people Terence recognized, local businessmen, and even a few officials. Sterling's network was bigger than he had imagined, and it was clear that he was more dangerous than they had thought. As Terence flipped through the pages, he felt a mix of anger and satisfaction. He had what he needed to take Sterling down. But he also knew that this wouldn't be easy. Sterling had spent years covering his tracks, and exposing him would mean going up against powerful people who would do everything in their power to protect him. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Lisa asked, watching him carefully. "This isn't just about Sterling anymore. You're talking about taking on an entire system." Terence looked up, meeting her gaze. "I don't have a choice," he said quietly. "I can't let him get away with this. Not after what he did to Darnell." The next day, Terence made a decision that would change everything. He went to see Darnell, who had been keeping to himself since the hearing, trying to move on but clearly struggling. They met at Darnell's apartment, a small but cozy place that was now filled with half-packed boxes and forgotten plans. "I need to tell you something," Terence said as they sat down. Darnell looked at him, confused. "I've been investigating Sterling. I found evidence, real evidence, that he's been taking bribes, manipulating cases. And I'm going to expose him." Darnell's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Terence, that man, he's dangerous. What if he comes after you? What if he finds out?" "He won't," Terence said firmly. "I've been careful. And I'm not alone. I have people who can help, people who want to see him brought down as much as I do. But I need you to be ready, Darnell. Because when this comes out, things are going to get messy." Darnell was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Do it," he said, his voice steady. "If you can take him down, then do it. I'll be ready for whatever happens next." As they spoke, Terence couldn't help but notice a new resolve in Darnell's eyes, a strength that hadn't been there before. It was a reminder of why he was doing this, why he was willing to risk everything to see Sterling brought to justice. The final pieces of the plan began to fall into place. Terence and Lisa gathered everything they had, preparing to make their move. But they knew they had to be careful. Sterling wasn't stupid, he would see them coming if they weren't careful. So, they set up a meeting with a state prosecutor, someone who had the authority to open an official investigation but had no ties to Sterling's network. The night before the meeting, Terence sat alone in his apartment, going over the evidence one last time. He knew the risks. He knew that if this failed, if they didn't have enough to bring Sterling down, everything he had worked for could be destroyed. But as he thought about Darnell, about the way Sterling had looked at him in that courtroom, he felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just doing this for Darnell anymore. He was doing it for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. The next morning, as Terence headed to the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. The tension was building, and he knew that this was only the beginning. Sterling thought he was untouchable, but he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The courtroom was packed. Word had gotten out, and now everyone wanted to see what would happen. For years, Judge Sterling had presided over cases with an iron fist, making decisions that seemed arbitrary but always somehow managed to serve his own interests. Today was different, though. Today, he wasn't the one handing down the verdicts. Today, he was the one being judged. Terence stood near the back of the room, his eyes focused on Sterling as he entered. The judge moved with the same air of authority he always had, his chin held high, a slight smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was as if he didn't fully grasp what was happening, or maybe he just didn't believe it. After all, he had spent years cultivating his power, shielding himself with connections and favors. To him, this was just another inconvenience, another show he had to sit through before things returned to normal. But Terence knew better. He had spent months working with Lisa, carefully piecing together the evidence, building a case so airtight that not even Sterling's most loyal allies could deny it. And now, the day had finally come. Sterling was about to face the consequences of his actions, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the proceedings began, the air was thick with tension. The prosecutor laid out the case against Sterling, detailing the bribes, the backdoor deals, the blatant manipulation of the law. Each new piece of evidence felt like a weight being lifted off Terrence's chest. He could see the cracks forming in Sterling's composure, the slight twitch of his jaw as the prosecutor continued to speak. But it wasn't until the witnesses were called that things truly started to unravel. One by one, people took the stand, business owners, former colleagues, even a few law enforcement officials. They all had stories to tell, stories of how Sterling had used his position to twist the system to his advantage, to intimidate and silence those who stood in his way. Terrence watched as the color drained from Sterling's face. For years, he had managed to keep everything under control, to keep his secrets buried. But now, they were spilling out for everyone to see. The final witness was Lisa. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and as she walked to the stand, she could feel every eye in the room on her. She took a deep breath, her hands steady, and began to speak. "I've been investigating Judge Sterling for months," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "What I found was a pattern of corruption, one that stretches back years. Sterling has been using his position to favor those who could pay him, to punish those who couldn't, and to ensure that he always got what he wanted. But it wasn't just about money. It was about power." The room was silent. No one dared to move, to breathe. Lisa continued, detailing everything she and Terrence had uncovered. The bribes, the falsified documents, the network of people who had helped cover up Sterling's actions. And then she said it, the piece of information that Terrence knew would be the final blow. Sterling's network wasn't just limited to the courtroom. It extended into the police force, the local government, even the business community. There were people who knew what he was doing, and they chose to look the other way because they benefited from it. But there's one person who didn't look the other way. One person who decided that enough was enough. She looked directly at Terrence. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. And then the prosecutor called his name. Terrence hadn't planned on testifying. He didn't want to make this about himself. But when Lisa had suggested it, he realized that this was his chance, his moment to say what he had been holding in for so long. He walked to the stand, his heart pounding, but his mind clear. "Judge Sterling used his power to destroy lives," he began, his voice steady. "I've seen it firsthand. I've seen how he used his authority not to deliver justice, but to control, to manipulate, to punish those who dared to stand up to him. And I'm not just talking about the people in this room. I'm talking about my brother." He glanced over at Sterling, who was staring at him, his expression blank but his eyes burning with a quiet fury. "My brother was trying to build a future, to create something of his own. But Sterling saw that as a threat. He used his position to make sure that dream was taken away, not because of anything my brother did, but because he wanted to remind us who was in control. Well, I'm here to remind him that no one is above the law. Not even him." The prosecutor nodded, satisfied. But as Terrence was about to step down, Sterling finally spoke. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence. "You think this changes anything? I've been doing this job for over 20 years. I know how the system works. You can throw all the accusations you want, but it won't stick. Not without proof." Terrence didn't flinch. "We have proof," he said simply. "And I think you know that." For a moment, Sterling's confident facade cracked. But then he regained his composure, leaning back in his seat with a smirk. "You're playing a dangerous game, Chief," he said quietly. "You really think you can win this? I've survived worse than you." The room was tense, waiting for Terrence's response. He looked at Sterling, meeting his gaze head-on. "Maybe you have," he said softly. "But not this time." As the prosecutor continued to lay out the evidence, Terrence could see the shift in the room. Sterling's arrogance was starting to backfire. The more he tried to deflect, to intimidate, the more obvious it became that he was cornered. And when the final piece of evidence was presented, a series of recorded conversations between Sterling and several of his associates, discussing the bribes, the deals, the threats, it was clear that there was no way out. Terence had managed to obtain the recordings through an informant, someone who had been part of Sterling's circle but had decided to come clean. It was a risky move, one that could have easily backfired, but it had paid off. The recordings were damning, and as they played, the room was filled with gasps and murmurs of disbelief. Sterling's face was pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. For the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation, the reality that he was no longer in control. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Judge Sterling?" the prosecutor asked, his voice echoing through the room. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Sterling stood up, his eyes cold, his voice low but firm. "This is a farce," he said. "You think you can bring me down with this? I've built this city. I've kept it safe, kept order. And this is how you repay me? By turning me into a villain?" Terence didn't look away. "No," he said quietly. "You turned yourself into a villain. We're just holding you accountable." The room erupted into murmurs as Sterling's lawyer tried to regain control, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The judge who had once commanded respect and fear was now facing the very system he had twisted for so long. And then, as if on cue, the doors at the back of the room opened, and a man stepped inside. It was Darnell. He had been hesitant to come, not wanting to relive the humiliation of that day, but he had decided that he needed to see this through. He needed to see Sterling face the consequences of what he had done. As Darnell made his way to the front, the room fell silent once more. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He simply stood there, looking at the man who had tried to destroy him, who had used his power to make him feel small, insignificant. And in that moment, Sterling finally seemed to understand that this wasn't just about the law. It was about the people he had hurt, the lives he had tried to control. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "You've heard the evidence," he said. "You've seen the faces of those who were wronged." Judge Sterling thought he was untouchable, that he could act without consequence. But today, we have a chance to show that no one is above the law. Not even him. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Terence felt a sense of calm wash over him. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he knew they had done everything they could. And as he looked over at Darnell, he saw the hint of a smile, a glimmer of hope that had been missing for so long. The wait was agonizing. Minutes felt like hours as everyone sat in silence, waiting for the jury to return. And then, finally, they did. The foreman stood, his expression unreadable, and began to speak. Terence held his breath. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain: Sterling's reign of fear and control was over. And no matter what the verdict was, he would make sure the truth came to light. Because justice wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The courtroom was silent, everyone leaning forward, waiting for the verdict. Terence could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his breath shallow. It had all come down to this. Months of work, late nights, and the risk of losing everything. He looked over at Darnell, who was sitting a few rows away, his hands clasped tightly together. This wasn't just a verdict, it was a moment of reckoning, a moment to see if the system would finally do what it was meant to do. The jury foreman cleared his throat, his hands slightly trembling as he held the piece of paper. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Judge Richard Sterling, guilty on all counts." The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing off the walls, almost surreal. For a second, no one moved, no one breathed. Then a murmur swept through the room, a wave of disbelief and relief. Terence felt like he had been holding his breath for hours, and as he exhaled, he realized he was shaking. Sterling's face was a mask of shock, his usual smug composure shattered. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The prosecutor stood, addressing the judge now presiding over the case. Your Honor, in light of the jury's decision, we request that Judge Sterling be remanded to custody immediately. As officers approached Sterling, he snapped out of his daze, turning toward Terence with a sneer. You think this changes anything? He spat, his voice low but dripping with venom. You think you've won? I've seen men like you try to take me down before. They failed, and so will you. This is temporary. I'll be back, and when I am, you and your brother will regret ever stepping foot in my courtroom. Terence didn't flinch. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and looked Sterling straight in the eyes. No, you won't, he said, his voice calm, steady. You're done, Sterling. The people who protected you, who turned a blind eye, they won't anymore. They're not coming to save you. It's over. Sterling's eyes blazed with fury, but there was something else there too, a flicker of fear. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. He was the one standing in front of a judge, facing a sentence, and there was nothing he could do to change it. As the officers began to lead him away, he turned back, his expression twisted with rage. I'm not finished, he said, his voice louder now, echoing across the room. This city needs me. You're just a pawn, Terence. You're nothing without that badge, and the second they don't need you, you'll be nothing again. You'll see. Terence watched as Sterling was led out, his words hanging in the air like a bitter aftertaste. For so long, those words might have gotten to him, might have made him question himself. But not now. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had fought for. Sterling was right about one thing, this wasn't just about him. It was about the city, about a system that had allowed men like Sterling to thrive for too long. And maybe Sterling wasn't the last of them, but he was a start. As the courtroom began to clear out, Terence walked over to Darnell, who was still sitting, staring at the spot where Sterling had been. You okay? Terence asked softly. Darnell looked up, his eyes bright, but there was a heaviness there too. I don't know, he said quietly. I thought I'd feel better, you know. But all I can think about is how close he was to getting away with it. How many more there might be out there. Terence nodded, understanding. He almost did. But he didn't. And you know why? Because you didn't give up. You stood your ground, even when he tried to tear you down. That's why he's in handcuffs right now. That's why he lost. Darnell was silent for a moment, then he smiled, a small, tired smile. You did that, Terence. Not me. No, Terence said, shaking his head. We did this. Together. The room was almost empty now, except for a few journalists and legal aides gathering their things. Lisa walked over, her notebook in hand, and she looked at Terence with a mixture of relief and pride. I have to admit, I didn't think we'd get this far, she said. Not when we started. Neither did I, Terence replied. But we did. Lisa's expression softened. So, what now? Sterling's out, but you know this isn't over. The people who were working with him, they're still out there. And they're going to be scrambling now, trying to cover their tracks. Terence nodded, a thoughtful look crossing his face. I know. But that's the next fight. For now, we take a moment to breathe. To remember why this mattered. Lisa's eyes flickered over to Darnell, who was now talking quietly to a reporter, his hands gesturing as he spoke. You think he's going to be okay? He will be, Terence said. It'll take time, but he's stronger than he thinks. As they stood there, the door to the courtroom opened, and Sterling's lawyer entered, his face tight with tension. He walked over to Terence, his steps brisk, and for a moment, it looked like he was about to start an argument. But then he stopped, hesitating, before speaking. This isn't the end, he said quietly, almost as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. You know that, right? Sterling's people, they're not going to take this lying down. They're going to fight, and they're going to make things difficult for you. For all of you. Terrence's expression didn't change. They can try, he said. But we're not afraid of them. The lawyer looked at him, searching for something, maybe a hint of doubt, but he found none. You're making a lot of enemies, Chief, he said finally. More than you realize. I know, Terrence replied, his tone unwavering. But I'd rather have enemies for doing the right thing than friends for doing nothing. The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but then he closed it, shaking his head slightly before walking away. Terrence watched him go, a sense of finality settling over him. He knew there would be more battles ahead, but for now, he had won this one. And that was enough. As he turned back, he saw Darnell approaching, his eyes shining with gratitude. Terrence. I don't even know how to thank you, he began, his voice choked with emotion. I didn't think anyone would ever listen, that anyone would ever see what was happening. But you did. You believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Terrence put a hand on Darnell's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. You don't have to thank me, Darnell. You're my brother. And I will always stand by you, no matter what. But this wasn't just for you. It was for everyone who thought they didn't have a voice, who thought they had to stay silent. Sterling silenced a lot of people, but not anymore. Not today. Darnell nodded, blinking back tears. I don't know what's going to happen next, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I know that if I have you with me, I can face it. You can, Terrence said, smiling. And you will. The two of them stood there for a moment, surrounded by the remnants of the chaos, but for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of peace, a sense of hope. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a step toward a better future, a step that they had taken together. As they walked out of the courtroom, side by side, the reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, questions being shouted from every direction. Terrence felt a pang of discomfort. He had never liked being the center of attention. But he held his head high, ready to face whatever came next. One of the reporters managed to push through, a microphone in hand. Chief Terrence, do you have any final words after today's verdict? What does this mean for Charleston's legal system? Terrence paused, thinking carefully before he spoke. Today's verdict was about more than just one man, he said, his voice clear and strong. It was about sending a message. That no matter how powerful you are, no matter how many people you have in your pocket, the truth will come out. And when it does, you will be held accountable. That's what justice is. And that's what we'll continue to fight for. As they made their way to the exit, Terrence felt Darnell's hand slip into his, a silent gesture of gratitude, of solidarity. He squeezed it, a quiet promise that no matter what happened, they would face it together. The sun was setting over Charleston, casting long shadows across the streets, but there was a warmth in the air, a sense of possibility. For the first time, Terrence allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to live in a city where people like Sterling didn't get to decide the rules. A city where people like Darnell could dream, could build, without fear. And as they stepped out into the fading light, he knew that dream was worth fighting for. The echo of the gavel declaring Judge Sterling guilty had faded, but the impact reverberated throughout Charleston. It wasn't just another case, it was a seismic shift. For years, Sterling's courtroom had been a place of quiet dread for many, a place where people walked in with hope and walked out with broken spirits. But now, the man who had ruled with an iron fist was gone, and in his place was a sense of uncertainty, a question hanging over the city: what happens next? Terrence had thought that hearing the verdict would bring relief, a sense of closure. But as he walked through the precinct the next morning, he realized that this was just the beginning. The case against Sterling had opened Pandora's box. It wasn't just about one man's downfall anymore, it was about the system that had allowed him to operate for so long. People were beginning to ask questions, questions that had been whispered for years but never spoken aloud. And those questions needed answers. As he sat in his office, Terence glanced at the pile of new reports on his desk. Complaints, allegations, old cases being reopened. The trial had emboldened people, given them the courage to speak up. But it also meant that everything Sterling had touched was now under scrutiny, and that included people who had once been seen as untouchable. Terence knew that some of those people were not going to take this quietly. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Lisa. "Hey," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and caution. "We need to talk. Something's happening, and I think it's going to get ugly." Terence felt a knot form in his stomach. "What is it?" he asked. "I've been hearing things," she continued. "Sterling's allies, they're not happy. They're starting to push back, and they're going after the people who testified against him. They've already filed appeals, trying to get his conviction overturned, claiming the evidence was fabricated. They're desperate, and that makes them dangerous." Terence sighed, rubbing his temples. He had known this was a possibility, but hearing it out loud made it real. What do they expect to gain from this? Sterling is guilty, Lisa. Everyone knows it. It's not about proving his innocence, Lisa said quietly. It's about sending a message. They want to make sure no one else tries to do what we did. They're trying to scare people into silence, to make sure no one ever questions the system again. Terence leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. The victory against Sterling had felt like a triumph, but now it seemed like a catalyst for something much darker. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We fight," Lisa replied, her tone firm. "We make sure Sterling stays behind bars, and we keep pushing. If they want to intimidate us, we show them we're not afraid." But as the days went by, it became clear that the situation was more complex than Terence had anticipated. Sterling's allies were indeed pushing back, but they weren't just focusing on the trial. They were targeting Terence, Darnell, and anyone else who had been involved in bringing Sterling down. There were whispers, rumors being spread about Terence's conduct, attempts to discredit him and paint him as someone who had a personal vendetta against Sterling. It was infuriating, but it was also effective. People who had once been supportive were now hesitant, unsure if they wanted to get caught up in something that was quickly spiraling out of control. And for Terence, it was a reminder that the fight for justice was never simple, never straightforward. It was messy, complicated, and sometimes it felt like taking one step forward only to be pushed 2 steps back. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Terence found himself standing outside Darnell's shop. The place was still under construction, the walls half-painted, boxes of supplies stacked in every corner. Darnell had decided to move forward with his plans, even with everything that was happening. It was his way of reclaiming what Sterling had tried to take from him. But as Terence stepped inside, he could see the tension in his brother's eyes. "Hey," Terence said, trying to sound casual. "How's it going?" Darnell looked up from the counter he was sanding, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Slow," he admitted. "But I'm getting there." Terence nodded, but he could see the exhaustion on Darnell's face, the way his hands shook slightly as he worked. "You know, you don't have to do this alone," he said softly. "I know," Darnell replied, setting down the sandpaper. "But I need to. I need to prove to myself that I can still do this, even after everything that happened." There was a pause, a silence that stretched out between them. "People are talking," Terence said finally. "They're trying to turn this around, make it look like we were the ones in the wrong." Darnell's expression darkened. "I heard. They're saying you went after Sterling because of me, because you couldn't handle the fact that he ruled against me. They're trying to make it sound like you abused your power." Terence clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. "It's not true. I did what I had to do because it was the right thing. But now they're twisting it, trying to make it seem like this was personal." "Of course it was personal," Darnell said, his voice suddenly sharp. "He attacked me. He used his power to destroy everything I worked for, and you stood up to him. That's not a bad thing, Terence. That's what makes you different from him. Terence blinked, surprised by the intensity in Darnell's voice. But if they convince people that I overstepped, that I went after Sterling out of some kind of vendetta, everything we did could fall apart. Darnell stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Terence's. So what? You're going to let them scare you into backing down? You think Sterling would have hesitated if he had the chance to destroy you? He wouldn't. But you did the right thing, and now they're afraid. They're afraid because they know that for once, they didn't get away with it. Terence felt his brother's words sink in, the truth of them resonating deep within him. You're right, he said finally. I'm not going to let them scare me. But we need to be smart about this. We need to show people that what we did wasn't just about one man, it was about fixing a system that's been broken for a long time. Darnell's expression softened, and he nodded. Then we do it together. We make sure everyone knows the truth. As the days passed, Terence and Lisa worked tirelessly to counter the efforts to discredit the case against Sterling. They released more evidence, documents that showed just how deep the corruption ran. They gave interviews, telling their side of the story, making sure that the people of Charleston understood that this wasn't just about a personal vendetta. It was about accountability, about making sure that no one else would have to go through what Darnell had endured. But the more they pushed, the harder Sterling's allies fought back. It became a war of narratives, a battle not just in the courtroom but in the court of public opinion. And for Terence, it was a test of everything he believed in. He had always thought that if you did the right thing, the truth would eventually prevail. But now, he was seeing just how easily the truth could be manipulated, distorted, turned into something unrecognizable. Late one night, after yet another meeting with Lisa, Terence found himself walking through the streets of Charleston, lost in thought. The city felt different now, as if it was holding its breath, waiting to see which way things would go. As he passed by a small cafe, he heard someone call his name. He turned to see an older man sitting by the window, a familiar face from the neighborhood. "Chief," the man said, beckoning him over. "Come sit for a moment." Terence hesitated, then joined the man at the table. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their coffee, before the man spoke again. "I've been watching what's happening," he said. "A lot of people have. And I just wanted to say, thank you." Terence looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For standing up to him," the man replied. "Sterling, he hurt a lot of people. Not just your brother. But no one ever had the courage to stand up to him like you did. And now, people are starting to believe that maybe things can change. That maybe justice isn't just a word." Terence felt a lump in his throat, and he struggled to find the right words. "I'm just trying to do what's right," he said finally. The man nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "And that's why it matters. Because you didn't do it for yourself. You did it for all of us." As Terence walked home that night, he thought about the man's words, about everything that had led them to this point. He knew that there would be more battles ahead, that Sterling's allies weren't going to give up without a fight. But he also knew that they had done something important, something that no amount of intimidation or deceit could erase. They had shown people that justice was possible, that even the most powerful could be held accountable. And that was a victory worth fighting for. As he looked up at the night sky, he could feel the tension building, the anticipation of what was still to come. Sterling was behind bars, but the forces that had kept him in power were still out there, lurking in the shadows. And Terence knew that if they wanted to truly change things, they would have to confront those forces head-on, no matter the cost. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and this time, there would be no turning back. The appeals had been denied, and the last of Sterling's allies had been silenced. It had been a long, grueling fight, but now it was over. Judge Sterling was officially stripped of his title, sentenced to years behind bars for his crimes, and his network of corruption had been dismantled piece by piece. It was a victory that felt almost surreal to Terence. For so long, he had been pushing forward, fighting against an invisible force, and now, for the first time, it felt like he could finally breathe. The city had changed. The people who once felt powerless were starting to believe that they could make a difference. Sterling's trial had sparked a wave of accountability. Officials who had turned a blind eye to injustice were being scrutinized, and new, honest faces were stepping up to take their place. Charleston was beginning to heal, and there was a sense of cautious hope in the air, a hope that maybe things could be different. For Darnell, the victory was personal. The day Sterling's sentence was announced, he reopened the doors to his cafe. It wasn't just about the business anymore, it was a symbol of resilience, of reclaiming what had been taken from him. On opening day, the cafe was filled with friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had followed his story. As he stood behind the counter, handing out cups of coffee with a wide smile, it was clear that this was more than just a victory, it was a new beginning. Terence was there, standing by his brother's side, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could see the happiness in Darnell's eyes. The shadows of the past were still there, but they were fading, replaced by the warmth of a community that had rallied together to support him. As the day went on, people came up to Terence, shaking his hand, thanking him for what he had done. It was a strange feeling. He hadn't sought recognition, hadn't done any of this for praise. But seeing the gratitude in their eyes, he realized that his fight had meant something. It had made a difference. A few days later, Terence received a letter. It was from Sterling. The envelope was crisp, the handwriting neat, but the words inside were anything but polite. Sterling's bitterness was evident, his refusal to accept his fate clear. He blamed everyone but himself, lashing out at Terence for ruining him, for tearing down everything he had built. Terence read the letter slowly, then folded it and set it aside. It didn't matter anymore. Sterling's words had no power, no weight. They were the last desperate cries of a man who had finally been forced to face the consequences of his actions. Lisa, who had been there through it all, suggested they burn the letter, but Terence shook his head. "Let it be," he said. "It's just a reminder of what happens when you let power corrupt you. He's done, and I don't need to waste any more energy on him." Instead, Terence focused on what lay ahead. He had seen what could happen when people stood together, when they refused to let fear dictate their actions. And he wanted to keep that momentum going. He started initiatives within the police department to address corruption, to ensure that justice was truly blind. It wasn't easy, and he knew there would be setbacks, but he was ready for the challenge. Because this time, he wasn't fighting alone. One afternoon, as the sun set over the city, Terence and Darnell sat outside the cafe, watching the people pass by. It was a simple moment, but it was one they had both fought hard to reach. Darnell turned to his brother, a smile playing on his lips. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad all of this happened. Not the pain, not the struggle, but what came out of it. I'm stronger now. And so are you." Terence looked at Darnell, his heart swelling with pride. "We're both stronger," he said. "And we're not done yet. There's still a lot to fix, a lot to change. But at least now, we know it's possible." They sat there, quietly taking it all in, knowing that their journey wasn't over but that they had overcome the hardest part. Together, they had faced down the darkness and emerged on the other side, not just as survivors, but as victors. Sometimes, standing up for what's right can feel like an impossible task. It can feel like you're going against forces too powerful to change. But this story shows that when we stand together, when we refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice, we can make a difference. Terence and Darnell's journey wasn't just about defeating a corrupt judge, it was about showing that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. Have you ever felt like your voice didn't matter, like the system was too big to fight? This story is a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage can lead to change. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight, but every step forward, every stand against injustice, counts. It's not just about one person, it's about a community coming together, supporting each other, and fighting for what's right. What did you think of this story? Did it inspire you to believe that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your own experiences, and let's keep this conversation going. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful, thought-provoking narratives. We've got many more stories to tell, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. Thank you for watching, and remember, every voice counts, and every story matters.